They found him dead in his apartment with a catheter tube wrapped 3 times around his neck. No sign of a struggle, no clear explanation. And just months earlier, Phil Schneider had told audiences that if they ever heard he'd taken his own life, they shouldn't believe it. Phil wasn't your average conspiracy theorist. He was a geological engineer who claimed to have worked on secret underground bases, seen alien technology up close, and survived a firefight between humans and something that wasn't human. Some people call him a hero, others call him a fraud, but here's the thing. When you start looking into his story, the lines between fact and fiction don't get clearer. They get messier. And buried in that mess are details that make it very, very hard to walk away without questions. In 1979, Phil Schneider was doing what he did best, digging into the earth for a living. He was working for Morrison Knudsen Inc., a company that had their hands in some of the biggest engineering projects of the time. But this job, though, wasn't just another tunnel or mine. He was part of a geology crew sent to carve out something massive beneath the New Mexico desert, near a place called Dulce. The blueprint, a colossal underground facility supposedly dropping 2.5 miles below the surface and stretching across 7 levels. And no, this wasn't the kind of thing you'd find on any public records. At first, things got weird early. The drills kept failing, snapping, stalling, overheating. Then one day, the bit broke through, and out came a plume of black sooty air, thick and choking. Schneider swore it reeked like rotten garbage left in the sun for a week. Not exactly the welcome you'd expect from untouched rock. If you've ever smelled something that makes you instantly think, no, I'm out, you get the idea. But Schneider wasn't out. He put on a protective suit, stepped into a lift with his pistol, and headed down to see what was clogging up the works. The deeper he went, the stranger it got. Instead of just miners and engineers, there were armed soldiers, special forces already on site. Now, if you're wondering what special forces were doing hanging around a geology project, so was he. At the very bottom, the story takes a sharp left turn into science fiction, or something else. Schneider claimed he found himself staring at a 7-foot-tall, grey alien. Not the cute, big-eyed kind you see on t-shirts, but one he described as stinky, with a smell he couldn't compare to anything human. Before he could process it, another one showed up. That's when things broke loose. Schneider reached for his pistol and fired, killing 2 of them, at least according to him. But the fight didn't stop there. One of the aliens fired back, not with a simple zap gun, but with what he called a plasma weapon. The shot hit him hard. It burned away some fingers on his left hand, tore into his chest, and even vaporized his shoes and toenails. Somewhere in the chaos, a Green Beret grabbed Schneider, shoved him into the elevator, and started the ascent. That soldier didn't make it back. Schneider called his death the ultimate act of sacrifice, a man giving up his life so someone else could tell the story. Up to that point, Schneider counted about 30 men in the chamber when the firefight erupted. Then, as if things weren't bad enough, another 40 or so personnel dropped into the shafts, walking right into the fight. By the end, Schneider estimated around 60 people were dead, made up of special forces, Secret Service, FBI and Black Berets, and that he was one of 3 humans who walked away alive. From a normal afternoon to a disturbing afternoon that almost cost him his life. And if you're thinking this was just some one-off nightmare, Schneider said no. In his view, and after much research into what happened to him, Schneider claims Dulce was just one node in a sprawling underground network. He claimed there were 129 deep underground military bases across the United States and nearly 1,500 worldwide. Each was supposedly connected by high-speed magnetic levitation trains capable of hitting Mach 2. These weren't just little bunkers. He described them as sprawling underground cities, more than a mile down, with volumes anywhere between 2.66 and 4.25 cubic miles. The construction tech, he said, was as advanced as the facilities themselves. Laser drills that could chew through 7 miles of rock in a day. Whole networks connected like arteries under the planet's skin. And Schneider wasn't just a guy who heard about it. He claimed he unknowingly helped build more than a dozen of these bases in the US alone, plus others overseas in Malta, West Germany, Spain and Italy. For Schneider, Dulce wasn't just a job gone wrong. It was the moment he crossed some invisible line from the world most of us know into one. most of us can't even prove exists. Phil Schneider had a history, a pedigree that put him right in the path of secrets most people never even hear whispers about. Phil was born on April 23, 1947, at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Not your average birthplace, but it was his family background that really set the tone for the mythos he built around himself. He often spoke about his father, Oscar Schneider. In Phil's telling, his dad wasn't just a Navy captain. He was a wartime scientist, neck deep in really classified projects. Phil claimed his father worked in naval medical research and nuclear medicine, took high-speed photographs of early atomic tests at Bikini Atoll, and even caught unidentified objects in the blast footage. And to top it all off, before all that, his father had been a German U-boat captain who was secretly folded into US service under shady backroom arrangements. In the mid-80s, Phil's life was fairly ordinary. He met his wife, Cynthia Dreyer, and after a brief courtship, the two married in Carson City, Nevada, in 1987. That same year, they welcomed their daughter, Marie, into the world. For a while, it seemed like a stable family life was within reach. But beneath the surface, tensions grew, and by 1990, the marriage had come to an end with their divorce. By the early 90s, Phil was stepping out of the shadows and into the UFO and conspiracy conference circuit. Maybe it was the divorce, or maybe he just got fed up hiding his experience. But he decided to be bold and share his experiences. Between 1994 and 1996, he was everywhere in that scene. People recorded his talks, transcribed them, and wrote up summaries for newsletters. On stage, he didn't just speak. He showed things. Photographs, documents, artifacts. He said some came from his father's files, others from his own work. One of his more specific claims involved Operation Crossroads, the 1946 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. These tests are some of the most documented events of the 20th century. You can find high-speed footage, aerial shots, and still images in government archives and museums. But Phil said his father's personal set of photos from those blasts showed something the official ones didn't: strange objects moving away from the explosion site. In other words, UFOs. Here's where Phil stopped sounding like a guy with a handful of strange stories and started talking like someone who had an entire blueprint of how the machine worked. In his view, it wasn't a scattered collection of odd events. It was one giant, interconnected system with its own funding, infrastructure, and its own deals with beings not from around here. Phil said the US was running what he called an ultra-classified black budget, and it wasn't pocket change. He put the figure at roughly a quarter of the entire gross national product, about $1.25 trillion a year. All of it, he claimed, was pumped into programs that never show up in any budget hearings. Deep underground military bases, off-the-books tech research, reverse engineering hardware that didn't come from Earth, and so much more. Unlimited money means unlimited tunneling, unlimited procurement, and unlimited ability to bury things, literally and politically. He painted a picture of how the money moved: hidden line items, dummy corporations, contractors that existed on paper only, channeling funds to real-world teams with the right clearances. Forget conventional cost estimates. If you've got a financial pipeline no one's allowed to audit, a billion-dollar tunnel is basically a rounding error. Phil didn't want anyone imagining a few dusty bunkers scattered around the desert. He was talking about 129 of these facilities in the United States alone, and nearly 1,500 worldwide. Each one was supposedly a mile or more beneath the surface, stretching out over multiple cubic miles, linked together by high-speed magnetic levitation trains that could touch max speeds. Not your average subway ride, the scale mattered to him. Hundreds of connected underground cities meant you weren't looking at a localized secret. It was global. If true, it would mean there's a second world running under our feet, designed for both human and non-human use. When he broke down how it all worked, it read like a classified engineering manual. Construction crews, he said, used laser drilling rigs that could eat through 7 miles of rock in a single day. Explosives were used to carve out caverns the size of city blocks. Maglev corridors are sealed and pressurized to move people and equipment without anyone above ground being the wiser. Power plants and life support systems run indefinitely. Waste management. all of it scaled to sustain thousands of people in total isolation. And what for? Well, it was for strategic command centers, research labs for things we aren't supposed to know about, biogenetics work, and safe havens for elites if the New World Order ever decided it was time to pull the plug on normal society. But the part that glued all of this to his alien firefight story was what he said happened back in 1954. According to Phil, the Eisenhower administration signed an agreement with extraterrestrials. In some circles, it's called the Greada Treaty. In others, the Grenada Treaty. The terms were straightforward enough. The aliens have advanced technology, things like propulsion systems and exotic materials to give us. In return, they'd be allowed to conduct limited abduction and implant experiments on humans and animals, with the understanding that the government would be told every time it happened. On paper, that's the kind of arrangement you could imagine a few hard-nosed Cold War strategists making. The payoff was tech decades ahead of our rivals. The cost was, well, let's just say the human side of the bargain didn't exactly get a vote. But the aliens didn't keep to their deal. Phil claimed it didn't take long for the aliens to blow past the limits. More abductions, more implants, and no courtesy calls to Washington. He said this breach triggered conflict between certain military factions and the extraterrestrials, setting the stage for violent encounters like the one he described in Dulce. Phil didn't just tell this story with no proof, he tried to show it. At lectures, Phil sometimes brought out a sample of metal he said came from the technology exchange. He described it as practically indestructible, made from niobium, which is a real, high-temperature, superconducting metal we actually use here, and something else he called marinite, which he claimed is an extraterrestrial element you can't find in any periodic table. He linked this mystery alloy to real-world applications too: stealth tech, secret propulsion systems, reverse-engineered vehicles that could make a conventional fighter jet look like a toy. And in his telling, this wasn't hypothetical. It was already in use inside the black budget world. You can argue all day about documents and eyewitness accounts, but a strange, unidentifiable hunk of metal, that's tangible. And Phil knew it. And that's what kept people listening. Whether he was talking about trillion-dollar hidden budgets, underground cities connected at max speeds, or backroom treaties with non-humans, Phil always delivered it like a man convinced he was describing the way the world really runs. To him, the firefight in Dulce wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a bigger, older arrangement. One that, if you believed him, was still going strong. It's one thing to say the government's hiding a few files. Phil Schneider didn't stop there, he went straight for the jugular, claiming that some of those files hid details about the ugliest deal in human history. In his telling, certain alien species weren't here for peaceful exploration, or even resource theft. No, they were here for us. Our glands, our enzymes, even our hormonal secretions. And if you're wondering how, he said they preferred to take it straight through the skin. According to Phil, to some of them, humans were little more than walking lunch bags. That was the part that got under people's skin. By framing it in biological terms, Phil made it more than a distant sci-fi concept. This wasn't about shiny spacecraft, it was about your body being stripped for parts. It gave the conspiracy a moral edge, and if what he said was true, it made the stakes feel sickeningly personal. He painted the process with unsettling precision. First came the abductions, not just humans, but animals too. Phil believed that during these encounters, implants would be surgically tucked into the body. Phil said some of these devices were so advanced that they could track, manipulate, or monitor their hosts. Then came the harvesting, enzymes and glandular material extracted for alien consumption or research. And this was already happening as Phil was speaking. Around 1975, everyone in the western region of the United States started hearing about these strange cattle mutilations going on all over the area. Not only were cattle being killed under mysterious circumstances, but their organs were also being removed with surgical precision. I'm talking about a kind of precision that only lasers should be capable of achieving. On top of that, all the mutilations had several distinct marks, a prominent one being that whoever or whatever was mutilating these cattle was anything but random. For each case of mutilation, the eyes, ears, genitals, and internal organs were removed. Not only that, there was hardly any blood left on the scene, nor were there any signs of struggle. Till now, no one knows what was responsible for the cattle mutilations. Phil also added that the United States government wasn't entirely innocent in all this. According to him, biofacilities hidden deep inside those underground bases weren't just for studying alien physiology. They were about figuring out how to fight back, or maybe just how to keep up their side of the bargain. That was the part nobody could quite decide was more chilling, the idea of a secret war, or a secret collaboration. Phil's narrative didn't stop at biology. He tied it to what he claimed was hard, logistical evidence of a very human plan for control. Somewhere in the early 90s, he began citing a curious procurement order. 107,200 full-length railroad cars, each outfitted with 143 pairs of shackles. You do the math, that's space for over 15 million detainees. According to him, these weren't just rail cars, they were mobile prisons, ready to move citizens who resisted a looming technocracy. Phil even laid out how it would work. Cars produced by major contractors would be staged across the country, ready for rapid deployment. Paired with the deep underground military bases, the DUMBs he talked about so often, the system could swallow people whole, relocating them to places no journalist, lawyer, or family member would ever reach. And if that sounded too hypothetical, he pulled in real-world tragedies to emphasize the urgency. He pointed to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. In the World Trade Center case, he said melted concrete and steel extrusion patterns didn't match what conventional explosives could do, at least not without some highly specialized devices. In Oklahoma City, he pointed to shifting official narratives, almost like the story was being rewritten in real time. His implication was clear. These events weren't just domestic terrorism, they were test runs for weapons and control measures, hidden under public outrage. He also talked about thermal signatures, the exact heat needed to liquefy concrete or stretch steel, and how chain of custody problems in investigations made it too easy to pin the blame on convenient scapegoats. If true, it would mean those responsible weren't the names in the headlines, but people, or programs, working under total immunity. The bigger picture, according to him, was that parts of US defense policy were serving as both a mask and a muscle for this hidden agenda. The Strategic Defense Initiative, those mysterious blackout helicopter flights, and even the work of Special Forces units overseas, Phil claimed they were all pointed toward goals the public would never know. And then there was the deadline, 2029. Phil told audiences that multiple alien species, 9 in total by his count, intended to shrink the human population down to about 1 billion. That's not a gentle curve over centuries. That's 5/8 of humanity gone in less than 4 decades. In his framing, this was more than policy. For at least some of these species, it was about food supply. Humans, or at least parts of them, were on the menu. The methods he described weren't just out of a horror script, they were disturbingly plausible in a geopolitical sense. Engineered pandemics, controlled access to food and water. Wars staged not to be won, but to keep numbers falling. DUMBs, in this scenario, weren't just storage vaults or research labs. They were where you'd run the tests, hide the failures, and keep the operations insulated from public view. By the time he'd laid it all out, Phil's story had become a sort of conspiracy equation. A secret budget feeds the construction of underground cities. Those cities house joint programs between humans and aliens, trading tech for biological samples. Prison trains and elite military units provide the muscle, exotic alloys, and unexplained implants are the breadcrumbs. And looming over it all is a new world order framework, with UN connections acting as the political glue. Each piece leaned on the others. If you bought the idea of a $1 trillion secret budget, suddenly the existence of alien alloys didn't sound so far-fetched. If you accepted that treaties might exist, the abduction numbers became more believable. And if you were willing to see major news events as cover for weapons test, then the rest of his story slid into place, like a completed puzzle. Of course, it all hinged on whether you believed Phil Schneider was revealing hidden truths or weaving a grand, terrifying fable. But one thing's for sure, he never played it safe, and he never aimed small. Phil's story slides into a wider, troubling pattern, one he'd warned about himself in those uneasy lectures. Phil often told audiences that people who spoke out too much tended to vanish or commit suicide, under circumstances no one could quite explain. Take Danny Casolaro. He was chasing what he called the octopus, a sprawling mess of political scandals, secret banking networks and weapons deals. The kind of knot, Phil would say, was tied by the same people who kept underground bases hidden. In August 1991, Casolaro was found in a hotel bathtub in West Virginia, wrists slashed a dozen times. The coroner called it suicide. Friends called it impossible. Danny couldn't stand the sight of blood, and he'd just told people he was days away from cracking the case. His notes? Gone. Just like Phil said would happen to anyone who got too close to the truth. Fast forward to Gary Webb, the Pulitzer-winning reporter who linked the CIA to the crack cocaine epidemic. His 1996 Dark Alliance series rattled powerful cages, just the kind Phil insisted were above the law. 8 years later, Webb is found with 2 bullet wounds to the head. Official cause, suicide. It's technically possible, but as Phil once put it, possible isn't the same as believable. Then there's Max Spears, a British UFO researcher who spoke about mind control, shadow projects and alien involvement. Territory Phil spent years mapping out in grim detail. In 2016, Spears is in Warsaw, texts his mother, "I'm in trouble," and dies soon after. Initial cause? Natural. Later, pneumonia and internal bleeding. No clear explanation for why a healthy man in his 30s collapses like that. And then there's Linda Moulton Howe. Still alive, but her career is like a guided tour of locked doors. In the early 80s, she was presented with information said to come from a military source, touching on agreements with non-human entities, eerily similar to Phil's Grader Treaty claims. She was promised a Pentagon interview. Then, without reason, it was pulled. Sources went quiet, evidence disappeared. Exactly the same wall Phil said would rise if you got too close to the core secrets. I've actually covered Linda Moulton Howe before, talking about her claims and the unusual obstacles she's run into over the years. If you're curious about that side of the story, hang around until the end of this video. I'll link it so you can check it out next. It didn't feel like Phil Schneider was just giving talks anymore. By 1995, his appearances had the energy of a man racing a clock he knew he couldn't beat. He didn't just warn audiences, he practically pleaded with them to understand the stakes. By this time, he had had 13 assassination attempts in a single year. Not threats, not anonymous letters, but life and death encounters. Bullets fired. A car forced off the road. Lug nuts were deliberately loosened so a highway drive could turn into a fatal crash. These weren't stories you tell if you're worried about sounding paranoid. They were stories you tell when you want people to remember them if you don't make it home. And he made sure they would. More than once, he told both friends and audiences that if the headlines ever read, "Phil Schneider found dead by suicide," they shouldn't believe it. He framed his warnings almost like instructions. Remember this, because it's going to matter. He told crowds that his time was running out. Sometimes it came out as gallows humour. I might have 6 months, I might not. But if I keep talking, maybe God will let me talk my head off. It was the kind of line you laughed at in the moment, then thought about later when you were alone. In the following months, his stories took on an even more claustrophobic edge. He claimed black helicopters hovered near his home, sometimes low enough to rattle the windows. He talked about bugs in his apartment. The surveillance devices were hidden right where he lived. Every movement, every conversation, maybe even every thought, was monitored. And still he kept talking. If anything, the tempo picked up. His lectures became more frequent and more urgent, as though he'd decided there was no reason to pace himself. By September 1995, at what became one of his last major public appearances, the Preparedness Expo, he went for broke. I'll leave a link to the full video in the description for anyone who wants to watch it in full. That day, he didn't just share pieces of his life. He built the whole architecture of his theory in one sitting.
Is to link up basically what's going on with these deep underground military bases, what they're being used for, what is the present situation now being employed both by our federal government, which is slowly being phased out by the United Nations government, as well as the New World, end quote, the New World Order, which is an even higher entity, and who these higher entities are taking their orders from, and try and link up basically what's going on.
It didn't feel like a talk you give if you're expecting a long retirement. It felt like a man putting every card on the table, even the ones that might get him killed. Schneider wasn't just hinting anymore. He was calling out the names, pointing to the machinery, and daring whatever forces he believed were after him to make their move. By early January 1996, Phil Schneider had been living like a man who'd already read the last page of his story. He'd warned everyone who would listen that he was marked. Not just in a casual, "I've got enemies" way, he meant it literally. He told friends, told his audiences, told anyone with a tape recorder that if they ever heard he'd taken his own life, they should call it what it was: murder. And then, just like he'd said, he turned up dead. It was January 17th when they found him in his Wilsonville, Oregon apartment. The estimates said he'd been gone for days. Some of the first responders handled it like a natural death. But once the official process rolled through, autopsy, paperwork, the whole clinical routine, the cause of death came back as ligature strangulation. The manner, suicide. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear suicide and ligature in the same sentence, my eyebrows start climbing. It's not the most common way people take their own lives, especially without hanging. And in Phil's case, the details were even stranger. Phil's ex-wife, Cynthia Dreher, was one of the first to start pulling at those loose threads. She said the scene itself didn't sit right. Friends and the apartment manager had gone in after no one had heard from him. They found his head resting on the seat of a wheelchair, his torso on the floor, his feet tucked under the bed. Odd doesn't quite cover it. There was a pool of blood on the floor next to the wheelchair, but no blood on the chair itself. Then there was the ligature, a length of rubber catheter tubing wrapped around his neck 3 times, knotted. According to the official file, that's what ended his life. Cynthia didn't buy it. She knew his body better than most. She knew the injuries, the missing fingers on his left hand, limited shoulder motion, surgical scars and implants. She argued it would have been physically near impossible for him to wrap tubing around his own neck that tightly, let alone tie knots with that kind of force. And here's where it really gets murky. Cynthia said the coroner's office took blood and urine samples but then refused to run toxicology. Why? Because, she was told, the death had already been ruled a suicide and they would not waste money on a suicide. Those samples, she said, were supposed to be stored for a year, but when independent testing was finally sought, poof, they were gone, either destroyed or missing. In a case like this, that's not a small footnote. That's the sort of thing that makes you wonder if someone wanted the mystery to stay a mystery. If Phil's death was a straight-up suicide, there were other details that didn't make sense. His valuables, cash, and personal effects, all still in the apartment. But the stuff he used for his lectures, the annotated notes, photographs, and rare metals he claimed came from secret projects, those were gone. Cynthia and others argued that's exactly the kind of material someone would collect if they wanted to make sure a whistleblower's work never saw daylight again.
And I went into the apartment after his death. His higher math books, his notes that he was writing for his book, all the photographs, all the alien materials, everything was gone. Now his wallet, his jewelry, his money, things that most people think of as valuable was still there, untouched. Except his wallet was kind of a weird thing, but that's another story. It's just that the police go, oh, well, somebody stole photos, huh? They stole what? What?
They don't understand.
Yeah, you're just making it up. Why would they steal that stuff and leave all this other stuff here? It wasn't a burglary, it wasn't a murder, it was just a suicide. And I know it wasn't.
Oh, absolutely.
Even the chain of events around the autopsy raised eyebrows. Several accounts traced back to Cynthia's letters and interviews say his body was initially released to a funeral home before any autopsy was performed. It was only after a funeral home attendant reportedly noticed something around the neck that the body was sent back for a proper examination. That's a chain of custody slip you can't unslip. And in forensic work, that kind of detour can complicate everything. Over the years, photographs from the scene and autopsy have circulated among researchers and documentary filmmakers. One recent film, The Underground Director's Cut, claimed to show never-before-seen images alongside interviews with Cynthia and others. They point out inconsistencies in the photos, Phil's body position, the way the blood pooled, and the absence of obvious defensive wounds. To them, these aren't minor quirks, they're clues. And remember, Phil wasn't exactly quiet in the months before this. He was making the rounds, telling bigger and bolder stories about government alien treaties, black budget projects, and a plan to drastically cut the world's population. He was waving artifacts in front of audiences. And crucially, he was telling everyone that his life was on the chopping block. This is where the timeline starts to feel like a bad script you wouldn't believe if it were fiction. To make matters more suspicious, Schneider's death wasn't the only dubious death in his circle. Take Ron Rummel, for example. He wasn't just some name in Phil's circle. He was the co-creator and publisher of Alien Digest, a short-run UFO magazine in the early 90s that wasn't afraid to poke at the edges of what the government didn't want discussed. Often described as a former Air Force intelligence officer, Rummel worked closely with Phil, who is believed to have contributed to the publication. On August 6, 1993, Rummel was found dead in a Portland, Oregon park, officially ruled a suicide by gunshot. But the case closed label never sat right with the people who knew him. Friends pointed out alleged oddities, a gunshot wound to the mouth, yet no blowback blood on the weapon. And a suicide note slanted, as if written left-handed, even though Rummel was right-handed. These claims have been repeated for decades in UFO and conspiracy circles, though the official files to fully prove or disprove them have never been made public. For Phil Schneider and his ex-wife Cynthia Dreyer, this wasn't just a friend's death, it was a warning. Alien Digest folded soon after, and Phil believed Rummel's fate was proof of what could happen when you push too close to certain truths. Now, I'm not here to declare which version is gospel truth, but I do know how forensic experts approach these things. Suicide by ligature, meaning strangulation without suspension, is rare. When it does happen, investigators comb through the details with extra caution. They're looking at the pattern of neck injuries, the way tissue is damaged, whether the knot could realistically be tied by the deceased, and whether toxicology backs up the theory. They look for signs of a struggle, or the absence of one. They weigh the scene as a whole. In Phil's case, some of those puzzle pieces were missing, others were blurred, and some were just plain strange. And here's the thing, when a man spends his last year telling the world he's being targeted, survives what he claims were multiple assassination attempts, and warns people not to believe it if they hear he's taken his own life, then ends up dead in a way that fits none of the clean, obvious boxes. That's not just a tragic ending. That's the kind of ending that keeps the questions alive, long after the body's in the ground. Now, despite all these proofs, a lot of people don't believe Phil's story, and before you call them out and say they are stupid for not believing, because trust me, I almost did the same thing, they also pointed out things that make the story not sound truthful. Just like there is proof supporting Phil's theories, there is also proof disproving Phil's theories. One of the favourite talking points is one of Phil's Rhyolite 38 clearance. He said it was dozens of levels above top secret. Critics jump on that like it's the easiest win of their careers. They point out that US clearances officially stop at confidential, secret, and top secret. After that, it's compartmentalized access, SCI, SAPS, but nothing with a nice cinematic number attached. And yes, Rhyolite is a real word in classified history, but not the way Phil used it. It was the code name for a Cold War spy satellite program, not a badge of elite clearance. Their argument is that Phil took a real term from the Black Ops world and repurposed it into something that sounded cooler.
Now, the Rhyolite was a top-secret surveillance satellite system developed at TRW. Rhyolite refers to SIGINT, okay, which is a short form for Signal Intelligence Satellites. And Phil was not involved with this type of work at all. So he did most probably not have a Rhyolite.
Then there's the way they trace the roots of the Dulce base story. They lean heavily on what happened to Paul Bennewitz, a New Mexico businessman convinced he was intercepting alien signals in the 80s. He was one of the people who also blew the lid off the Dulce base, and I covered his story extensively in this video, showing you his point of view on how he found out, and how he also suffered too, like Phil. Now, Paul did intercept alien signals, no lies, but here is the thing. The alien signals he thought he intercepted were actually the military sending made-up signals. Basically, they were playing a prank on him, making him believe he was communicating with aliens. Meanwhile, it was the military all along. And it didn't just stop there. The military messed up his life and his reality so badly that Paul went insane and was later admitted to a mental hospital. Air Force intelligence officer Richard Dulce has admitted he was part of a campaign to feed Paul Bennewitz disinformation. Supposedly, it was all to protect other classified programs. I mean, it's better they believe what they saw is an alien than they dig in and find out it is a covert next-gen weaponry. The skeptics see Dulce as a product of that same operation, an echo chamber of false leads. And if Dulce itself started as a planted myth, then Phil's Firefight becomes just another chapter in a book of tall tales. But here's where I stumble. The disinformation program's real. If they were willing to seed fake stories, what's to say they didn't also bury some real ones along the way? But more on that later. Next, the bombings. Schneider swore the 1993 World Trade Center attack wasn't just a truck full of fertilizer-based explosives, but a small nuclear device. He said the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing was the same deal. Too much destruction, too clean for a pile of ANFO to pull off on its own. But the official investigations weren't having it. The FBI's case file on the World Trade Center blast spells it out. A urea nitrate truck bomb, chemistry matched to what was found at the scene. And if there had been a nuke, it wouldn't just be a theory. The radiation footprint would have lit up detectors for miles. Nothing like that showed up. The Oklahoma City attack. FEMA's engineers dug into that one. The report said the Murrah building collapsed exactly how you'd expect from a massive ANFO blast placed right by the building's weak points. No radiation, no mystery warhead. Just fertilizer and fuel in the wrong hands. But bombs weren't the only thing on Phil's radar. He talked about a shadowy order for over 100,000 railroad cars, each supposedly kitted out with shackles, as part of some looming FEMA mass detention plan. It's the kind of claim that makes your skin crawl, until you see how often it's been recycled over the years. Researchers who track extremist folklore say these shackle cars show up every decade or so, usually with mislabeled photos of regular rail equipment, like autoracks or prison transports. No procurement records, no serial numbers, no contracts. Just a rumour that refuses to die. And then there was his body, with literal scars to prove his point. 3 fingers missing, a long chest scar. According to him, they were souvenirs from a 1979 underground firefight, when a beam weapon cut him down, but critics weren't so quick to salute the battle wound. Some people who knew him said the missing fingers looked more like a workplace injury than the aftermath of a surgical amputation from a laser hit. In such, some say he cut it himself. So it turns out that Phil was mentally disturbed. He was even admitted at the Damash State Hospital in Oregon, where he got treatment for schizophrenia for a while. And according to one of the reports, Phil would mutilate himself whenever he was stressed. It was probably due to mental stress that he amputated 2 of his fingers and 1 of his thumbs as well. In fact, we have information from the FBI that Phil once removed 300 pounds of radioactive material and stored it under his bed until it was detected by the FBI and removed. Either way, the consensus was that, be it workplace injury, mental health issues, or self-inflicted injury, the loss of fingers was natural and was not as a result of a shootout with aliens. And that chest scar, they said it matched scars from certain medical procedures. Then there's the radiation claim. Phil often said his cancer was caused by a cobalt dose from that same encounter. Skeptics pointed out that kind of exposure would have left medical records and dosimetry logs, and none have surfaced. Some of his stranger claims sat outside the Dulce firefight altogether. Like the time he said his family had original photos from Operation Crossroads, the Bikini Atoll nuclear tests in 1946, showing craft darting away from the explosion. It would be an incredible find except for 2 problems. First, he had the date wrong. The real tests were July 1st and July 25th, not July 12th. Second, the photos have never been shown in a way that lets anyone verify them. No negatives, no paper trail, no independent authentication. And we're talking about one of the most heavily photographed events of the Cold War. Now the funny thing is, despite all this, I was still giving him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he was up against the United States government, and they have the power to change your life in ways you can't imagine. And with Phil dead, they could change his life details since dead men tell no tales. And I know it's a bit conspiracy, but hey, you wouldn't be watching this video if you were not thinking the same thing too. But this was the straw that broke my back. It turns out everything he ever said about his father was all a lie. His father was never a Nazi U-boat captain, and Phil was simply repackaging ideas about Dulce base that were already in print, not that he had ever been there himself. It was the deal breaker for me. If he could lie about this to make his story more believable, what has he said that is true? And then we get to his death. For his supporters, the word murder hangs over everything. For critics, the paperwork says otherwise. The coroner ruled it a suicide by ligature. His ex-wife never accepted that and put out a letter listing things she thought were off about the scene, the hose around his neck, the way the body was found, and missing personal items. But that same letter acknowledges the suicide ruling, which skeptics say actually strengthens the official case. But the critics don't stop here. There's one name critics like to lean on here: Gabe Valdez. If you're deep into UFO lore, you know him as the New Mexico State police officer who investigated cattle mutilations around Dulce. He wasn't some government plant sent to discredit UFOs, he had unconventional beliefs of his own. And yet, when Phil's family asked him to look into the death, he said he found no evidence of foul play. For skeptics, that was the nail in the coffin. The critics also pick apart Phil's most cinematic moment, the underground shootout that left dozens dead. They argue that something that big would leave a paper trail, military logs, death notices, families asking questions, but we have nothing. The engineering critiques hit even harder. The maglev trains Phil described, Mach 2 city to city under the surface, just don't match reality. The fastest maglev ever tested topped out at 375 miles per hour, and that was on a perfect, above-ground track in Japan, not in a sealed tunnel hundreds of miles long. Same with the tunneling machines. Phil talked about 7 miles a day through the rock. The real record in hard rocks measured in a few hundred meters. Engineers call his numbers impossible. So where does that leave us? Honestly, square one. And the reason is because even though Phil lied about a lot of things, there are still a lot of things that he said that aren't totally lies. For example, Phil tied strange cattle deaths and missing people to non-human predators. The FBI actually ran an investigation into the cattle mutilations in the 70s and concluded it was scavengers, disease and weather. But even a baby born yesterday knows that conclusion is bullcrap. And even though Dulce base might sound unreasonable, the government has proven time after time that the unreasonable is just another Monday task to them. So you see where the problem lies. So yes, the critics have their data, their timelines, and their public records. They've checked the math, measured the machines, and cross-referenced the stories. But after all that, I keep coming back to the same feeling. There's too much in Phil's life and in his death that doesn't fit neatly into their explanations. And when things don't fit, you either cut off the edges to make them fit, or you admit the puzzle's bigger than the picture you've been given. You can line up every skeptical argument, every investigative report, every official explanation. And still, the shape of Phil Schneider's story refuses to fit into a neat little box. Sure, maybe some of his claims sound far-fetched, but then you look at the patterns, the overlaps with other whistleblowers, the sudden silences, the missing documents, and the way his life ended. You weigh all that against the odds of it being just coincidence, and the scale doesn't balance so easily. I'm not saying every word Phil spoke was flawless truth, but I've seen enough to believe he was pushing up against something real, something dangerous enough that it didn't want to be seen. And when someone spends their last years trying to shine a light on it, only to meet an ending like his, I don't think that's a story you walk away from shaking your head. I think that's a story you carry with you.